which is Russian New Generation Warfare, Theory and Practice. We have a great specialist speaking for us, Andras Racs, my colleague from Finnish Institute of International Affairs, Pīters Metsons, Swedish National Defense colleague, and Steve Latham from local organizers. And we proceed the same way as in an earlier session, so everybody has 20 minutes and then we go to the Q&A session. And so please, Andras, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you very much, and now we hear it. While we're waiting for the computer, I also need to make a disclaimer. Everything what I say here is just my private opinion. So it's a long list of organizations who I'm not representing. And of course, everybody always makes the jokes about how hard it is to speak after lunch. So let me make a different joke. Visit Russia before it visits you. This is what we are going to do right now. And what I would like to speak here in the remaining 14.5 minutes I still have is basically the research question I'm planning to answer is how this new form of Russian warfare is different from the conventional forms of asymmetric warfare, or with other words, the asymmetric warfare as we've known it before. And thereafter, we will try to make a bit of an outlook as well. And of course, I mean, in front of such a distinguished audience, there is not much need to speak too much about the development of asymmetric warfare. However, as always, we're not starting from Sun Tzu this time, but we go for the version B, and we start from Clausewitz. And the famous saying is very important, warfare is a political tool, we all know that. But Clausewitz also made a differentiation between asymmetric methods and symmetric methods. And asymmetric go into the direct objectives and indirect objectives of warfare. I mean, if you don't see it properly, one option is that you sit closer. Another option is that I will leave the PowerPoint here, so you no need to take notes. Why the difference between direct and indirect warfare is important? Direct warfare was called by Clausewitz as a form of warfare aimed at destroying the enemy or fundamentally breaking its ability to resist, while indirect warfare has been aimed just to exhaust your enemy and basically to make it ready to accept the deal. So this is the indirect warfare. It will be an important part later. And if we go through the development of asymmetric warfare, 19th, 20th century, Lawrence of Arabia, or Thomas E. Lawrence, has been the first one who discussed in detail, after Sun Tzu of course, the importance of rough, difficult terrain hard to pass for the purpose of asymmetric warfare. And then Vladimir Ilyich, he also contributed a lot to the theory of asymmetric warfare, particularly by addressing the need for propaganda, not only to discourage your enemy, but also to mobilize your own society. And it was Lenin who first officially put into the theory the legitimized option of destroying the leaders of the enemy, which you may also call it like a certain form of terrorism, as he put it. But anyways, in the theory of asymmetric warfare, it was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin who first discussed in detail that it's a legitimate form of warfare, that you go after the very leaders of your enemy. And both Mao Zedong and Tito, they both realized that simply irregular forces alone are hardly and rarely able to defeat committed regular forces. So both Tito in Yugoslavia and Mao Zedong in China, they both argued for the need to use regular and irregular forces in a combined way. Mao Zedong put it like the two arms of the body. The two arms have to work together in order to reach the final goal. This will also be important a bit later. And of course, the great Vietnamese theoretist Nguyen Giap, he also argued, though from a different basis, that indirect warfare needs to gradually develop into a full-scale direct warfare in order to completely defeat your enemy. And a much less known theoretician, Carlos Marighella, from South America. Carlos Marighella, who actually wrote a handbook of the urban guerrilla. And many countries which experience the riots are very lucky because the works of Marighella are not that widely translated. I mean, what Marighella has written is still actually in very many sense, so I recommend you to all to go to the beautiful building of the National Library and try to look up Marighella. You will find very interesting things, even though his work was written 40 years ago. And why hybrid war is in quotation marks? Because if we keep reading about the literature, of course, right now hybrid war became something very, very popular, right? In each and every Eastern European society, there are a few issues everybody is an expert on, right? Football, driving, and now hybrid war. However, hybrid war originally has meant something different. I mean, if you read the literature carefully, both McEwen and Nemeth, and later with Thomas Hoffmann, hybrid war as a term was originally used for characterizing the very fluid, hard-to-define warfare that the coalition forces met in Iraq. 10 years, actually, before Russia's recent operations. So hybrid war originally was defined as a combination of modern technology, modern mass mobilization, and modern communication as well. The first terms were used to describe the Chechen wars, and then the hybrid war literature has developed a lot while describing the specific form of warfare in Iraq, starting basically from 2003. The Hoffmann definition is quite important for us. According to Hoffmann, hybrid war could be defined as a form of warfare which is composed of four tools used in a combined way: conventional weapons, irregular tactics, terrorism, and cooperation with organized crime groups. This is the original meaning of the hybrid war. So, of course, this leads us to the question, if hybrid war is a term already used, then how should we call the form of warfare we've seen in Ukraine, both in Eastern Ukraine and the Crimea? Because hybrid war, I mean, originally, as we've seen, it's something different. The term has already been used. I mean, this name has already given to a child. And I very much liked the non-linear war concept proposed actually by Mark. However, we are in an unlucky situation that NATO has started to officially use the hybrid war. So the debate, the terminological debate, seems to be decided, could still be a good article, a theoretical article about how to name this thing. But since NATO, the alliance, has officially started to use the hybrid war, from now on I will stick to the hybrid war expression. And there is no need to speak much about, in front of such an audience, how this new generation of warfare, as Russians call it, has developed. The Gerasimov doctrine, also mentioned by Mark, is anyways a milestone in developing this form of warfare. The red parts are the important, so often with Russia. So the aim is not to destroy, but to disable your enemy state and armed forces, so not to kill the enemy soldiers physically if not necessary, but to break their morale and ability to resist. And the main front, as it was pointed out also by Yanis in his good article about this hybrid warfare, is that the human psyche is the main front where this new type of warfare is waged. Therefore, of course, information operations play an integral coordinated role in conducting warfare in this way. We will hear much more about the details from the lecturer coming after me. So my contribution to the debate, which I hope I will be able to write a longer piece soon after I'm done with the Christmas family visits and drinking, so hopefully in January, is first, what are the prerequisites of the hybrid war? Because after the Crimea operation, if you read the Western press, many people had the impression, many people were writing about this type of warfare as a new Wunderwaffe, something which is undefeatable, something which is unexpected. Not actually. I mean, there are certain prerequisites which are necessary for hybrid war being waged. First and foremost, as it was also pointed out, of course, by NATO analysts, that it's an absolute must that Russia has to be stronger than the country, I mean militarily, than the country it tries to attack. Because all over the Crimea operation, the threat of a conventional, massive conventional attack from mainland Russia against the other sections of the border, all along during the Crimea operation, this functioned as a deterrence. Ukrainian resistance was, Ukraine also decided not to resist because they were afraid of a large-scale, massive conventional Russian attack from the east and from the northeast. So this factor plays a key role in the efficiency of this hybrid warfare. So as a prerequisite, Russia has to be stronger than the targeted country, and the targeted country shall not have a collective defense guarantee. Because if the targeted country can rely on the help of a larger military alliance, then the credibility of the conventional attack as a deterrence factor is much less. It practically disappears. Point number two, and again, methodologically we are in a hard situation because so far our sample is not that big. We've seen one operation conducted fully in Crimea and one operation conducted in half, that's Eastern Ukraine. However, one may well presume, particularly if one reads Gerasimov with eyes open, is that another prerequisite is that the targeted country needs to have or shall have weak central power and weak state structures with heavily corrupted Silovic organizations, with badly functioning public administration, police of not that strong morale. So the weakness of a targeted country seems also to be a prerequisite. Again, I'm not posing here as somebody who knows the ultimate truth, so all these statements should be debated. I mean, if you have different opinions, I'd be really glad to improve this research. Third, the political factor. It also plays a role. I mean, there needs to be lasting regional dissatisfaction with the central power on which the hybrid war can be built. So in the Crimea, this regional dissatisfaction has been connected with the 2 decades-long failures of the consecutive Ukrainian governments to properly address the demands of the specific demands of the population in the Crimea, and also in Eastern Ukraine. I mean, following the change of power in Kiev, in Eastern Ukraine, I wouldn't say that the fears about fascists coming to power in Kiev, I wouldn't say that all those fears were completely ungrounded. I mean, in late February, around 25th, 28th February, I mean, what was the very first move of the Ukrainian government? I mean, Kiev was still in flames. The very first move they started with is to abolish the language law. I mean, President Turchinov interim President Turchinov was smart enough not to sign this law finally, so it didn't come to force. But the first signs were actually quite, I understand that the Eastern Ukrainian population got worried. So again, both in the Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, what we saw, that the lasting regional dissatisfaction with the central power functioned as a factor on which the Russian non-linear offensive could be built on. And another more tactical element is that there is a need for a massive presence of Russian-speaking population in the region, because this allows little green men to conceal themselves being locals. I mean, ethnically I'm from Hungary. I mean, if I imagine little green men coming to Budapest and try to pretend as local Hungarians, good luck. I mean, this thing could work only in the Crimea and could work only in Eastern Ukraine, because the massive presence of the Russian-speaking population allowed Russia to employ the discourse that these are not Russian special forces, these are just dissatisfied local people. Imagine trying the same thing in China. So this is also a prerequisite, which limits seriously the scope where this hybrid war can actually be employed. There is also, again, we don't know it for a fact. This is something inductive. From the 2 operations we see, one may inductively come to the conclusion that there is also a logistics requirement. The Crimea operation was conducted with the active support of the Russian troops already present in the Crimea. Those were the military bases which provided the logistics support for the operation. So, how I formulated it, either there has to be an earlier legitimate presence of Russian military on the ground, like in the Crimea, or in Eastern Ukraine, the attacked region has to have a direct border with Russia with weak or non-existent border control, because this is the way you can provide the logistics for your operation. And here in the room, I'm pretty sure that there are many people who are much more experts in logistics than I am. So let me go to the 6th part, which seems to be obvious, I mean, half a year after the operation, media and information warfare superiority, which allowed the attacking forces to information-wise take over the attacked region and deny the central power from promoting its agenda in the region attacked. So these prerequisites, in my point, constitute an argument against the Wunderwaffe nature of the hybrid war. In reality, it has quite a limited scope where hybrid war can be used. Why was it so effective? First and foremost, it was unprecedented. It came as a surprise, it came out of the blue, and because Professor Galotti was right, not that many people read the Vojenno-Promyślenie Courier. So, because of the lack of precedent, there was also no elaborated defense. Now the situation is much more different. We are here, we are discussing the whole thing, we are thinking about that, but this was not the case during the Crimea operation. Second, the possibility that the attacking country could long deny its involvement formally. I mean, Estonian colleagues on the second week of the operation published a very detailed analysis based on the weapons used, seen on the pictures and the technological background. So from the very beginning, it was obvious that those were Russian forces. I mean, with some locals involved, but mostly Russian forces. However, the deniability, it results in the lack of accountability. The attack country has no one to negotiate with. You don't have a partner to negotiate with. I mean, Russia could formally say that I'm not part of the game. You have to have an agreement with the separatists, either in the Crimea or in eastern Ukraine, which would have led to the scenario well known from Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia. This is the way how Moscow, 2 decades ago, made the separatists to be basically equal partners of the central power. They forced the Moldovan government in 1992 to sit to the same table with the separatists as equal partners. This was something, of course, the Kiev government simply could not afford. And, which was not the case, but theoretically the option was there, because Russia formally denied its involvement, theoretically it could have stopped the operation at any time. Little green men just disappear, and that's it. It would have been possible if Russia would have been forced to do so. And of course, we already discussed that the attack country could hardly differentiate between who are the real attackers and who are just local civilians because of this disguise of the attacking forces, and taking into account Russia's readiness and often declared willingness to use force to protect its own compatriots, this factor strongly limited the ability of the Ukrainian government to use force, even if it had been able to do so. And of course, we already touched upon the main factor why it was so effective, because of the constant danger of an overwhelming, massive attack by the conventional Russian forces lined up along the border with Ukraine. Now in eastern Ukraine, this kind of backfired after Kiev realized that the massive troops, I mean the tens of thousands of troops often lined up on the Russian side of the border, were actually not attacking. They were there, they were posing a threat, but they did not cross the border until actually August. And still in August, much lesser forces entered Ukraine than the forces which were lined up all along the border. And the communication stuff will be touched upon later by experts who are much better in information warfare than I am. And here comes the answer to the research question: why hybrid war has been new? What are the novelties of this hybrid war? First and foremost, that's why I refer to Clausewitz. Usually, according to Clausewitz, asymmetric means have always been used by the weaker side, right? To resist against the stronger regular army. Here in the hybrid war, it's very interesting because it was the stronger side which relied on asymmetric means. Second, even though hybrid war for a long time remained asymmetric, basically until the anti-terror operation in eastern Ukraine started to gain momentum, despite it remained asymmetric, it was still able to achieve direct objectives, namely the capture of territory, what we've seen in Crimea. Third, we already discussed that the formal involvement of the attacking country could be denied for long. So formally only proxies were engaged, actually are still engaged, except the Russian soldiers spending their holidays on voluntarily fighting in eastern Ukraine. I mean, based on that, the Russian army is the most liberal workplace on earth. I mean, imagine I go on holiday and take my tanks. This is something usually I'm not afford when going to holiday, but I could just still enroll. contrary to the original theory of both Mao Zedong and Giap, and also to a certain extent Thomas Lawrence, here in the Crimea case and partially to the Eastern Ukraine case, the outside military force, the regular force of the attacking country, did not actually participate in the attack. So it was not the two arms strategy of Mao Zedong. It was just the possibility of an attack which was maintained, and this disabled or seriously weakened the resistance capability of Kiev. Point number 5 was already discussed. It's not that much new in itself. I mean, irregulars mostly merge with the local population. I mean, partisans rarely dress up like partisans, they dress up like locals. The new element here was Russia's readiness to use force in the defense of its compatriots, which together really limited the ability of Kiev to use force. Many people called this type of tactics is the Palestinian tactics. However, there is a difference here. In the case of the Palestinian forces fighting, or Palestinian insurgents fighting the Israeli forces, there is no outside threat present. So no one would take a revenge, no conventional attack would be launched in revenge of the death of some Palestinian insurgents. So this is a big difference compared to classic Palestinian tactics and what we have seen in the Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. And another important thing, quite different to the earlier conventional forms of asymmetric warfare. Hybrid war, in fact, did not really require massive support of the local population. Just the illusion of it, just the image of it. I mean, even in July, August, separatists in Eastern Ukraine were complaining, I mean, Russian separatists in Eastern Ukraine, they were complaining that the local population was not that supportive. I mean, in cities of 1 million people like Donetsk, you could see pro-Russian demonstrations of 2,000, 3,000. Give me enough cash in a week, I can organize you 2,000 demonstrations here in front of the barracks in 1 week time. Getting 2,000 people together is nothing. It's not real local support. So it's not the local support the partisans of Tito had, or the partisans of the Pripyat marshes had. In reality, the local population was not that much of supportive of the active military actions taking place right in their neighborhood. However, if one reads Russian television, and it's much better than the morning coffee, so I recommend to everybody, I mean, to start your day with Russia Today, perfect. If you watch that, you would have the impression that the whole Eastern Ukraine is just rising up against Kiev, or there was a massive anti-Kiev movement in Eastern Ukraine. In fact, that there wasn't. This was a constructed thing, a constructed local support instead of a real, meaningful, popular support. At least on the tactical level. I mean, on the strategic level, if the local population is massively against you, hybrid war may become much less effective. We don't know it yet. We may guess, yet we do not know, because the events are not there. And another novelty, unlike classic asymmetric warfare, hybrid warfare does not depend on the terrain at all. I mean, if you read the classic partisan literature, they've been always hiding in the forests, in the marshes, or in the endless deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. This type of new warfare, asymmetric warfare, which is absolutely independent from the terrain. You can operate it in plainlands, you can operate it in the cities. This is connected to the real-time, very close coordination between the various actors of Russia involved in the conflict. And the extremely intensive coordinated information warfare will be addressed much more in detail by the next lecturers. So all in all, my point here, and I'm ready to debate that this hybrid war thing is not that much new. It's not the brand new tool. It's more, the innovation is how the old tools have been used in a new, much more coordinated way. And from all these, we may conclude that this hybrid war has a number of weaknesses as well. What we've seen in Eastern Ukraine, in the beginning it started quite similarly to the Crimea operation. However, because of a number of reasons not to be discussed here, what we have now, basically since the anti-terror operation started to gain momentum after the election of President Poroshenko on the 25th of May, the irregular forces in Eastern Ukraine managed to get into the same situation like so many irregular forces happened to be in the military history earlier. An irregular force cannot really hold the territory against advancing regular armies. If you have to really go straight and fight against an army when you have only light infantry and some occasional artillery support, but these irregulars had to fight against Ukrainian army using not only infantry but also armor, artillery, airstrikes and all that. It was not surprising that these irregular forces were losing ground. They just couldn't hold the territory against the advancing anti-terror operation, which resulted actually in Russia's direct military attack, massive military attack in the middle of August. Because separatists were close to losing the war, Donetsk and Luhansk, and Russia couldn't afford that. So at a certain point, if the attack country is able to resist militarily, the hybrid war may quickly get transformed into normal conventional warfare. Point number 2, if it gets transformed into conventional warfare, all the hindrances and negative effects of being involved in a conventional war start to occur. Political and economic costs, sanctions, the whole thing costs a lot, military losses occur, consequently you have to pay higher domestic price as well, because nobody likes his or her son coming back home in a body bag. So if the hybrid war gets transformed into a regular war, all its competitive advantages get lost. And from then on, you have basically a conventional military conflict with all its already known parameters. Third, but probably perhaps the most important from the perspective of many small countries neighboring Russia, if the deterrence element, namely the danger of a massive conventional attack from Russia, can be neutralized, for example by collective defense, meaning NATO, then most probably the whole hybrid war loses its effectiveness. Because, to go very blunt, if the first little green man appears, in Budapest, if we trust NATO collective defense, what would prevent the Hungarian forces from simply shooting or capturing the guy? That's it. If you can trust in collective defense, if you have a collective defense guarantee, and you have a well-functioning state, which I'm not going to comment in the case of Hungary, you can easily suppress the hybrid war right immediately when it starts. And my final point here, and again this is something to be debated, in my opinion, hybrid war, particularly because of the information warfare element, is strongly culture dependent. You can use it only in a certain culture. Because for strong information warfare, you need to employ the same language, the same discourse, like the attack country. And I'm absolutely not sure that this new way of warfare Russia could employ efficiently, let's say, against Uzbekistan or against China, simply because the culture is different. I'm not sure in that point, ready for debating it, but still I think it's an important factor. And of course comes the question, where else it's possible to use this new hybrid warfare? Ukraine again, basically at any time. Moldova at any time, because all the prerequisites are met. Weak state, regional dissatisfaction, lack of credible alliance, all that. I think under certain conditions, Belarus and Kazakhstan may also be endangered. Certain conditions means if the strong leader disappears. Because otherwise, all the factors are present. But as long as President Lukashenko and President Nazarbayev are there, I think the danger is not acute for either of these countries. Kyrgyzstan is a bit different story, and I think because of the collective defense and because of the prerequisites are not met here, Baltic, it's highly unlikely that anything similar would happen here in the Baltic states. And again, a theoretical question, are we sure that China is not going to learn this method? If I were the Chinese, I would intensively study what's happening. So I wouldn't be surprised in a few years' time to see little polite Chinese men appearing somewhere in Southeast Asia. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Andras, and then Pīters Metsons. Floor is yours.
Friends and colleagues, I'm very glad to be here, and I shall try to give you maybe another picture of Russia and what we have heard so far. I'm running a Swedish research project on regular warfare, and we have done this since 2011. And we studied IDF in Israel first, and then we have studied Russia. No, I don't want to. And we have studied Russian sources, primary Russian sources, to try to understand how do they think without any filters. And this is a part of the sixth generation warfare. And in Russia, it is to defend your own country, to defend your people, to defend your society, and to use every resource you have in the country. So, sixth generation warfare is against the weakest part. It's the society. And I can tell you that in Sweden now we discuss our ability to defend our own society against aggression from Russia. And we are quite weak if we look at our societies, if someone is conducting this kind of warfare against us. I will talk about that. Yeah, the Russians, they have thinking about this many years. They're one of the best military thinkers in the world, and they have done that and published in their newspaper, Military Thought, on his museum, since 1920. And the Chinese, you talked about them here, they wrote the book 1999, Unrestricted Warfare. There you can read everything about hybrid warfare. And here you can see that technology is important for the Russians. Science is important for the warfare. And this change of technology means also that we have to change the operational concepts and operational methods. And we can also see that you try to get synergy. You get synergy from information warfare and psychological warfare. You use all these methods together as you use all your assets from the society together, not only military. And here is the famous doctrine we have heard about today. And the problem we have in Sweden and in the West is that we still think about the old war, the old way of conducting war. Russians, they talk and think about a total war, where all parts of the society is included. And we can read it in one missile very clear here. And we can see that the military leaders and the political leaders are very tight together. Look at the training, the big exercises in Russia. The politicians are there. Putin is in every big exercise. The defense minister. How many exercises have we seen in Sweden where we have our defense minister with us? That was many, many years ago. And we can also see that the information superiority is the main objective in the beginning of the conflict. And Maskirovka, of course. And we can also see that the Russian thinking is offensive. They are defensive, but they have offensive thinking. Like the Israeli, they are also defensive, but they have offensive operational thinking. So when they conduct operation, they are offensive. This is a full scale of the non-contact war against Sweden from a country called the Red Land. This is only the first hours of air operations against us. This was a war game we conducted with our students 1.5 years ago. I can tell you this was not easy. Slipchenko, he talked about attacks with 1,000 to 1,500 precision weapons in the first wave. Yeah, the Russians have learned from others. So, in a full-scale operation, every airport, every harbor is closed. If we use this kind of warfare. This is the more familiar that is described, as we also saw in the report that Yanis wrote, Chekhinov and Bogdanov. And then we can see main ingredient in the beginning is information and psychological warfare. And that is what we now experience in Sweden. We have these underwater activities. We have had simulated air attacks against important Swedish military bases. We have Russian tourists travel around in Sweden monitoring our exercises. That happens now. And we can see asymmetric actions. And also to manipulate, as we have heard here earlier, journalists, researchers, politicians, key personnel, even military personnel. And then we have the normal operation. An operation when you can reach every target in the operational area at the same time, simultaneously. That is the kind of new warfare. Okay. Now we should look at this operation, and I have based it on a Russian assessment. Maybe we have only read NATO assessment, but this book from CMTO should be in every family home this Christmas, I hope. $100. It's worth everything. So, now we will see how they will describe this operation for us. First, the background. This is not a small operation. 2.5 million people living there. And as you have said here earlier, 65% of them are Russians. And we have also 22,000 military personnel here. It's not a small force. And here is not the best quality in this map, but remember how huge this area is, and you can see that there are Ukrainian forces everywhere. So the Ukrainian forces was like this. And we can see they had helicopters that could fly, they had tanks, not everyone was operational. They had quite good artillery systems. And you can also see that anti-air defense system, not bad. The Air Force, substantial. Maybe only half of these MiGs could fly, but there were some. And a very good air defense. Not bad at all. I would like to have that on Gotland if I could get it. And of course, internal troops to handle people. And this is something we had missed. When the Russian is training, when they do their exercises, look at the numbers of internal troops on the civilian authorities. In the Russian defense plan, it's 49 authorities and independent institute that has written it. They are under the command of who in crisis and war? Chief of General Staff. He is commanding them, and Monday, was the day when the command center was opened, the National Command Center in Russia. They prepared the society for heavy times. Okay, so we have little special troops here to take care of uprising and things. Now we will see here the Russian operation. We can see these 4 phases. So the preparation phase, and then the launch of it and the build-up and how they use the forces. And it will be very interesting to see now, is it a balanced force or is it the 2 armies, as we have been told here earlier today? Okay, preparations. There are 5,000 men going in here, together with the independent Marine Brigade. So 5,000 men against 22,000. Well equipped, but not so well trained as these guys. This is the best of the best they have. So they go in first. And what do? There is 193 military objects that intelligence had described that should be neutralized. So they go in for them. And we see 6 days with only 5,000 people. What happened these 5 days, 6 days? What do the Russians do during this period? They put a pressure on East Ukraine with massive military forces. Show force distraction from this. They show force against Ukraine. And we don't know what kind of people this is. We suppose that it's Russian people going in here, but we don't know that really. And we heard these stupid stories that they have bought uniforms. Yeah, you can buy uniforms in Moscow. You can buy weapons also, but 5,000 people. So, next. Then we get little substantial forces, but still special forces. And here is the first units that could really engage the heavy weapons the Ukrainian has, the attack helicopters, and this is the first time we see them in use. And we can see also the dependence they have on heavy transport to transport these forces. It's still physical distances you have to deal with. And you also use the landing ship. So this is not blitzkrieg. It takes time to do this. And they are taking considerable risks here. So it takes a few more days before you have the heavy forces coming in. And they are transported by train, because here comes the tanks. And then we are at the date of 15th of March. So it takes time to get these forces. And here, the Russians have enough forces to defend themselves from air attacks and from Navy attacks, if that will happen. And also enough with artillery. And the last phase is this one. And then we can see what kind of orders did the Ukrainian have. Hold on. Ignore acts of provocation. Don't do like the Georgian did. Don't ignite the war. No use of weapons. Maybe the Ukrainians should, by the greater numbers they had, rounded up the Russian forces. So the Russian forces rounded up Ukrainian forces, and then Ukrainian forces rounded up Russian forces. If they have done that, then maybe they have succeeded. That's maneuver warfare. So, it takes almost 1 month for the Russians to control all these 193 military objects. And we could also see, if we look at this operation, when the politician goes heavily in, Lavrov said in the beginning that it's no Russians, and here Putin goes in and says, you can come over and be soldiers in the Russian armed forces. So when they surrender, then they could just sign a new contract, and then they will be soldiers in Russia. The conclusions of this operation. It was a surprise on political level, on strategic level, on operational level. And we can see the operational art of war was world-class here. We can see that they have learned something from the catastrophe from Georgia, the Caucasian War, about intelligence. They had intelligence here. Very good intelligence. Good tempo, mobility, and they deliver effect. Discipline and professionalism. Only 2 people died during this operation. 1 Russian and 1 Ukrainian. That is maybe the most extraordinary with this operation. It's only the operation 1808 when the Russians occupied Gotland, when only 1 Swedish sailor dies, that can beat that. But that was many years ago. Logistics worked. Russia put up logistic base and they could deliver. But it took time. And the problems. What risk did they have? How calculated was this risk? How well prepared was this operation? It was planned, but how well prepared was it? How much help did they get from inside to do this? Elements of force. When we look at this, very few of the Russian units is manned fully. So they have problem to fill up their ranks. Joint operations works here, that's important for them, and also combined weapons. And now they have got these planes there. They build up Navy and coastal defense there, and also with ground troops. So to kick them out from Crimea militarily will be difficult. I guess a political solution would be the best. So, that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
And then last presentation was Steve.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be back here in Riga. I'm not an academic. I call myself an interested military practitioner, or was until July this year when I left the military. But I spent 26 years in UK military, working predominantly in information operations, psychological operations. The last few months of my service, in the early summer of this year, was spent in Ukraine, looking on the ground at how Russia was waging information operations. And very interestingly, being in the Ministry of Defense, in the National Security Council in Kiev, and looking firsthand and seeing the paralysis, indecision, confusion, distraction that senior people were facing and were struggling to cope with. So I'd like to start my presentation with a quote which will really sum up the point I'd like to make this afternoon. And it's a quote that ordinarily doesn't seem to apply. It's to do with Al-Qaeda. Quotes by a noted counterinsurgency specialist, Dr. David Kilcullen, a former Australian infantry officer and advisor subsequently to the US military. But the point that he makes there is that in that particular case, but let's just make it directly relevant, information operations we use traditionally in the West, in NATO, as a supporting arm to military operations. Military operations take primacy, kinetics, and we use information to support those. The point Kilcullen was making in relation to Al-Qaeda, but I think it bears relevance to what we saw in Ukraine, is that our adversary takes a completely different approach, 180-degree different approach, and says, I'm much more interested in the effect. What is the best way to achieve that effect? And in Al-Qaeda's case, in IS's case, and arguably in Russia's case, it was through this complex information operation, which military forces played only a supporting role. And even then, they didn't wear badges, and we knew who they were, but they confused people. We weren't absolutely 100% certain at the time that they were conventional Russian military forces. So that, I guess, is the center point of my piece to you this afternoon, is that if this is a pattern or a template for the future, and I highlight the word if, then we may not be well prepared in our existing structures to deal with it. Second quote I want to give you is, well, this guy's featured prominently this afternoon, and I'm not a Russian expert, but it's interesting how he talks about the rules of war have changed. Well, I don't know whether they've changed or not, but I think the opportunities and the techniques that have been employed and can be employed in the future are indeed very different. We've already heard about various military philosophers through the years and the idea of seeking asymmetric advantage. And there's, of course, a line that you can draw directly back from Russia's operations in Ukraine through to, if you want, Sun Tzu and breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. But the space in which this is conducted is different. The information environment, the information domain, is largely unregulated space. And it presents somebody with great opportunity to exploit it to their advantage. And secondly, I think we can all agree that Article 5 is not going to be invoked on the basis of a few trolls' tweets and some disingenuous misinformation websites, even though they can have significant informational effect. And the third quote I want to put up is from General Breedlove, sat here. And I put that up, not because I actually agree with him, but because in just a line, it expresses the great surprise, the shock that operations in Ukraine triggered within NATO. The most amazing information warfare blitzkrieg that we have ever seen. Okay, but I'm not entirely sure about that. I could look, for example, at IDF operations in Cast Lead and Operation Pillar of Defence, where the stronger military power, the IDF, waged a huge information war before, during, and after its kinetic attack on Gaza, as being equally notable in terms of use of information for warfare. But that quote really struck me as personifying the shock that our structures went through. And I saw it firsthand in the National Security Council in Kiev. People absolutely paralyzed by indecision and confusion. So, what I'd like to do is just address sort of a few questions about the issue and think in the context of that quote from David Kilcullen how we might fare in the future. So the first one is this a threat to the NATO alliance and its members? Well, I'd say not a direct threat, only if it is a stepping stone for something else. Clearly it was in Ukraine, but it only was in Ukraine because we allowed it to be. We were caught napping. The fact is that we allowed Russia far too much space to maneuver in the information environment in Ukraine, and they found there was no response. No response from Ukraine, no response from NATO. Now, if this had been conventional military maneuvering, there would have been a response. And we've seen that response. We know the European Leadership Network lists 40 incidents between April and November this year in which Western militaries have been in direct contact with Russian military assets. The Swedish submarine, numerous air encroachments into territorial airspace. And just recently, last week, I saw my own former service, the Royal Navy, shadowing a large fleet down through the Channel on its way to the Mediterranean. Why do they do it? Well, they do it for the reasons that they've always done it, because they want to observe Western response times, and they want to understand NATO cohesiveness and NATO capability. We're pretty good at that type of stuff, yet we were not good in Ukraine, and they filled that vacuum very quickly. Now, that can't be allowed to happen again. Now, some of my colleagues have argued that you couldn't use that technique again in maybe just a few places, Moldova or possibly Ukraine. I would take a counter view and say, I think you can use that technique anywhere in the world very successfully. So some discussion about China. I'm going to come to China in a moment. But let me ask a second question. Now, this is real, we would say in the UK, a hot potato. I gave evidence at the House of Commons Defence Committee just a few weeks ago, and they were really keen to investigate what the bigger threat was. Was it extreme Islam, personified by Islamic State? Or was it this stuff from Russia? And they were forming the view that actually the biggest threat was Islamic extremism. Well, that's not an easy position to argue with. We had a soldier murdered in the streets of London in the name of extreme Islam. We apparently have shipped 1,000 to 2,000 young British Muslims to Syria, or rather they've shipped themselves of their own accord to fight for Islamic State. But I would actually argue, and I did to the House of Commons Defence Select Committee, that for all its ferocity, violence and newsworthiness, Islamic State is not actually an existential threat to the United Kingdom, and it's not actually an existential threat to NATO. But I'm not sure I could make quite so robustly the same argument about Russia, particularly with interconnectivity of financial systems, of energy sectors. Most of London seems to be now owned by Russian oligarchs. I think there is a very significant danger here that we are perhaps not recognizing in the face of more immediate, shorter-term issues, like, for example, IS. Somebody was talking about I think it was Professor Mark was speaking about the attention deficit of the West, and I saw that firsthand in the Ministry of Defence. We worked 24 hours a day for about 2 weeks preparing for the London conference on Somalia. And the day after the conference, that was it. There was no discussion about Somalia, on with the next issue. Anything to do with Somalia, finished, done, gone. Just run the conference, and now we move on. And I do worry in our structures that we have that problem. So, is NATO or its constituents equipped for information warfare? I mentioned that IS has managed to attract between 1,000 and 2,000 young British men through very sophisticated internet recruiting, the use of computer games, and the presentation of very stylized and glamorous images of the attractions of fighting jihad in Syria and Iraq. And we've not actually been very good at mitigating that. So I would suggest that we're probably not well equipped for wider concepts of information warfare. And I'm conscious that the term information warfare seems to just imply it is warfare conducted in the information domain, i.e. in the media, on the internet. And actually I take a much wider view and say it's all to do with effects. What are the effects you're looking to do? How can you achieve those effects? So it's anything that isn't conventional, for me anyway, any conventional military operations. So at the moment, I don't think we are particularly well equipped. Have the rules of war changed, or is Ukraine a phenomenon? No, I don't think the rules have necessarily changed, but as I said earlier, the domains in which conflict can be waged have. They've widened, deepened, broadened, and they've circumnavigated traditional systems and organizations. And, you know, we are still absolutely focused in the West on tanks, soldiers, planes, ships. That is the focus. In my service in the military, to be an admiral, I had to have commanded a ship. I commanded a psychological operations unit. That doesn't get you promoted as a naval officer. In the same way as an army officer doing information warfare isn't going to be promoted. It's not recognized still as a key component. And we need to change that mindset if we're to cope with some of the issues that I think we will have to in the future. Professor Mark estimated, I think I quote you right, that there was about 100,000 decent troops. And I think I got you right in saying that was quite a small number. Well, not in comparison to the size of the British Army, it ain't. We're going down to 82,000 troops, of whom only a small proportion will be frontline infantry. So actually 100,000 highly trained Spetsnaz who can maneuver in multiple domains, apparently with quite loose control and coordination. That's a big problem. That's not a small problem. That is a very big problem. And as my colleague, wherever he sat, so eloquently explained just now, you know, they operationalize those comparatively quickly with great skill and great precision. Let's not forget the British Army ran out of brigades in 2007 in Iraq and Afghanistan. They had to create new brigades from nothing because we ran out of enough soldiers to do the job. So let's be careful about banding numbers around. Let's focus on effects. And whether it was 100,000 or 50,000 Russian Spetsnaz, they certainly had a significant effect in the geopolitics of Ukraine and Crimea. So, my view is that NATO needs to place much more emphasis on this concept of information warfare. Now, how far is it prepared to go? This is a tricky one, very tricky. Are there any precedents we could look at? There are lots of precedents. During the Second World War, the United Kingdom assembled together a unique band of miscreants, misfits, strange academics, and odd people that you would never invite to a dinner party or let loose with your young children. But they came together in one place to form the Political Warfare Executive, and they took the fight to the Nazis with huge success. Now, I'm not for one moment suggesting that we need to necessarily recreate that, but I would say that we need to push back in these spaces where Russia has been able to maneuver, such that Russian people need to know that Putin's going to lose. And at the moment, I don't think they're getting that message. The message they're getting is, oh, he's doing pretty well, actually. And that's the wrong message. So what vehicles have we got to challenge, to mitigate, and to be proactive in getting the right message to the right audiences? Somebody spoke earlier, again, I think it was Professor Mark, who spoke about one of our weaknesses was we must always follow the rules, I think he wrote. And I think that's absolutely the case. We're very English about warfare, very British about it. Always have to follow the rules carefully. Well, they're not. And I'm not sure future adversaries will be quite as gentlemanly in their engagement as we might wish to be in our reply. So we need to take a much keener interest and be less risk-averse. I was talking to a colleague last night who works at the NATO Centre of Excellence here for strategic communication. And she was telling me the 7 member nations have signed up as supporters, funders, I don't know what the correct term is for the COE. That's 7 out of 28 NATO nations. Come on, we're not taking it seriously. Why have only 7 signed up? We've watched this year the importance of this stuff. It's no longer just tanks, ships, aircraft. NATO should be looking at the centres of excellence and thinking, yeah, I need to have somebody there. I need to be representing my country's view. I need to be contributing to the analysis and the research of how we're going to respond to this in the future. So that means having the structures that can analyse and can react. And in the UK, we used to have them. I was part of an organisation called the Advanced Research and Assessment Group. But it was one of the first things to be cut as we downsized. The view was, well, we just don't need that stuff anymore. And I would say, you know, obviously, I think that's been proven wrong. And we need people who wear uniform to be much more aware of the importance of this stuff. It's not just some secondary activity that weird people do. The number of times when I was in Afghanistan, when officers would look at me and say, you're a naval officer commanding a SARPS unit. I mean, what happened? Do you get seasick or something? Do you not like being at sea? Well, no, I'm just really interested in information warfare. I think it's really important. And they sort of raise their eyebrows and tut and think, poor chap. But, you know, let me give you an anecdote from Helmand. To get a PSYOPS leaflet out to the population, at one point in 2011, it was taking 3 weeks to get clearance for a PSYOPS unit to be deployed because senior military figures were so nervous about a piece of paper might appear on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post. And it was a pretty innocuous piece of paper, just advising Taliban how they could give up certain circumstances in which they could walk into police stations and give up their weapons. But people were so nervous because it was not within their past history or frame of reference. And they didn't know how to deal with it. This irrationality just it needs to go, and I hope this is something the COEs will address. Are there other countries we need to be aware of? Absolutely, and I'm really glad whoever mentioned China. On the 2nd of September, President Xi, can't pronounce it, said, we must change the fixed mindsets that exist within our military on mechanized warfare and instead create an environment accepting of information warfare. So whoever said, I wonder if the Chinese are watching Russia, damn right they're watching Russia. The president himself watched it and said, this is something we need to do. Now, anybody that's read any of the documentation, the literature that exists about the Chinese over the last 20 years, they developed a concept a few years ago called the 4 warfares concept. One of those branches of warfare was information. They see that it's important. They don't see it as being secondary to driving tanks, flying aircraft or ships. They see it as a primary lever. So I would not be surprised, whoever it was said, to see little polite Chinese soldiers pop up in different places in Southeast Asia on remote islands claimed by the Philippines or claimed by Japan. I would not be surprised to see that at all, because I think they're very good at learning. So, to conclude, I think that that Kilcullen quote right at the beginning encapsulates the problem that we have. That we need to have some really fundamental reviews of the place of, whatever you want to call it, asymmetric warfare, non-linear warfare, whatever it is, hybrid warfare, and its importance for future conflict. I think we need to put in structures that can spot this stuff and are empowered to react quickly, because we cannot have governments in the state of chaos that I saw in Kiev. And, you know, frankly, I don't think it would be terribly difficult for people experienced from operations in Ukraine to be mischievous and start prodding ethnic Russian populations in the Baltic or ethnic Russian populations in Moldova or Belarus, just to create chaos, to watch the West react. And I don't think that's acceptable. We must be able to demonstrate the same level of response as we demonstrate every day when conventional military assets appear in our airspace or our water. But there is a flip side to this as well. And the flip side is we have to be very mindful of the messages that we send. There's a Norwegian historian, I'm probably going to pronounce his name wrong, but Geir Lundstad. He talks of the double enlargement problem of EU and NATO, which he calls the creation of an empire by invitation. And there's a cartoon on the internet, and it's got a picture of a map of Russia absolutely surrounded by American military bases. And the quote is, really nasty of those Russians to put their country so close to our bases. I think we do have to recognize very legitimate concerns by Russia and understand those and weave those in to much more nuanced, focused, credible information operations of our own. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Okay, now after three very powerful speeches, it's time for questions. Please, Yanis, start.
Okay, it is rather a comment and a question. And my comment is that, well, the idea of new generation warfare by the Russians is much more than just agreement and hybrid warfare or asymmetric warfare. If we go through the phases, we can find in Russian military literature about the new generation warfare. We have first 4 phases of asymmetric, we have 2 phases of hybrid, and we have then like a 3 or 2 phases of normal military operations. So what I'm trying to say is that they are complementary. You start with one, it's not working, you go to the second one until you have the option. If you can achieve your tactical objective only using a non-military hybrid or asymmetric, as you wish, and you don't need to use real or direct military power, for them this is the best situation. It's like Sun Tzu said, well, the winner is the one not using force. So I'm saying this because regarding the employability or operationalization of the so-called Russian new generation warfare, there is an aspect to be taken into consideration which is really the tactical objective. So what is it? It is to gain territorial control, or the key word is, as many of the Russian military have been writing, and then it is really Steve's point, or it is influence. What do they want? Territorial control or influence? Because if they want territorial control, of course what Andras said about the presence of Russian minorities and sort of things, of course it facilitates a lot. But on the other hand, if we're talking about influence, and if we're talking about the idea of challenging the Western world order, for example, to establish some alternative wherever, then it can be an instrument of political destabilization to make the country under, let's call it, attack, to share the same strategic objectives of Russia, not necessarily being pro-Russia. And this is a trick thing, because then they are using democracy to go against democracy. But these are just a comment. My question is for Steve. Look, then, of course, INFOPs and PSYOPs are of extreme importance. Okay, but on the other hand, democracy is one of our most deepest values. So how can we confront Russian information operations keeping democracy at the same time? Because, for example, I don't see, you didn't say that, but I don't see, for example, forbidding TV channels or the sort of things. How would it be the strategy to neutralize then this sort of INFOPs and PSYOPs? Thank you.
Yanis, thank you very much indeed. I didn't mean to suggest that the solution was INFOPs or PSYOPs. It's just a component, just a tool. And I don't have I wish I had a crystal ball that would give you an instant solution. I don't. But I think at heart there needs to be a much more nuanced institutional understanding of what the problem is before we think about how we might deal with the problem. And I don't see that institutional understanding. One, because this is a comparatively new, I choose my words carefully, comparatively new issue for uniformed people at senior levels. Secondly, because certainly in the West, and I think particularly in the UK, the political imperative is not necessarily driven by this, but more mundane domestic issues which take up a lot of time and attention in our media. And this stuff gets squeezed to the side. And because I think there is a growing risk aversion culture. People are very concerned about how interventions might be portrayed. And I think certainly for the UK, that's one of the legacies of the Iraq War, the confusion and concern over how we ended up in a war in Iraq, dodgy dossiers and all this stuff has meant that institutionally the British public simply don't trust governments, I think, by and large, and particularly the communication elements of governments. And of course this falls within the communication domain. In terms of should we ban RT, no, of course not. Travelling on the London Underground the other day, there are posters everywhere it says RT and it's got redacted written across it. And it says, this is the problem if you don't have a free and fair media, obviously implying you should watch RT. Well, frankly, the take-up for RT in the United Kingdom is almost zero. On my free box, strangely enough, the RT channel comes in at channel 699, channel 700 is the adult channel. So, it's so far down the list of boxes that you're likely to flick to that it's just not a credible news source. So I don't have a solution for you, simply because we're in a bit of a mess as a result of events thus far. What we have to do is now lay groundwork, which means reinvigorating those organisations that are capable of research and analysis to provide us with early warning, so at least our policymakers are prepared for some of the options that they might have in the future, as opposed to being continuously reactive, which is essentially what happened in Ukraine.
Just to directly continue the thought, much better coordination of the research currently going on national levels is necessary. in order to avoid researchers thinking about the same things, parallelly wasting a lot of resources, but without coordinating the results. I mean, we could well learn this close coordination from the Eastern neighbor.
Absolutely. Can I just add something there? I don't think information warfare, Russian information warfare, is a direct threat to the NATO alliance or to the West. Where I think there's a direct threat is our corporate inability to deal with it. That's the threat to us, because in the absence of a response, they'll fill the vacuum. Not just Russia, but China might fill the vacuum, or Iran may choose to fill the vacuum, or whoever it is that's got a beef that day with the West may choose to fill it in a way that is disadvantageous to our strategic objectives. So I think, just absolutely to hammer home this point, and this is why I think the NATO Centres of Excellence are so important, that they can act as catalysts with their respective nations to coordinate some of this research to really understand what's going on.
I think the major problem is that we have weakened the national state, and we have underestimated the development and the strengthening of the state in Russia. If we look at the White Book from 2004, one of the major points there, major action points for the Russian, was to support the degrading of the military around themselves. And if I look at the numbers from 2004 to 2014, for my own country and other countries, they have been quite successful. And many, they have underestimated, researchers, military experts, has underestimated the strength of the Russian military. So, I think we need to pay more tax to have a society that can defend itself. That is really important for us. If we look at the national structure of how we defend our country, that is really a weak spot. So we need to look at this as a total mobilization of the resources in the society. And I'm not sure that the European Union or NATO is enough for that. We must have own self-defense capability. Thank you.
Okay, then we have 2 questions still, and then it's a coffee break time.
Nope.
Hello, I'm Nora from the Center for Security and Strategic Research, LNTA, and I have the question about deterrence. Dr. Racs mentioned that one of the ways you can counter this hybrid warfare, or whatever how we call it, is deterrence. And also one of the takeaways from the Vilnius conference 2 weeks ago, organized by George Marshall Fund, one of the takeaways, conclusions is that NATO its main task is to deter. And then there was a very good question, how much is enough for deterrence? So my question, well, firstly is for Dr. Racs, perhaps other speakers like to comment. So how much is enough to deter Russia? Well, we can take both states. The audience is interested, of course, in this region. Thank you.
Okay, there was a second question, please.
I already introduced myself, so going straight to the question. Actually, my question more intended to Mr. Rácz and Pīters Metsons. And it's very simple. So what's next? Your predictions for the development of the situation in the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk republics. Will we see any new elements of the, I don't know, a hybrid warfare, or Russians already stopped? And maybe a short additional question to Mr. Stephen Dedham. I always hear in this during this conference that this strategic communication, information warfare is something new. But then, what about this all experience from the Cold War, for example, era? Yes, we forgot everything, or it's really something absolutely new going on here? Thank you.
So please.
I also wish I would have a crystal ball here. You can share the crystal ball if you want. Deterrence. I think what Yanis raised is a very important question. What is the objective of the attackers? Just influence or territorial control? And my answer here that in case territorial control and the takeover of territory would be suspected, then that's the point where deterrence shall come and get activated. Because if we continue the logic other way around, against information warfare, it's very hard to argue that it would invoke Article 5. But territorial control, the slightest effort for territorial control with other ways to deny the central government from certain territory of its own country, that already, in my, again, personal opinion, should be a point where Article 5 should be activated and the full-scale answer is necessary. I mean, my point about taking out the little green man in the very first moment, this is what I meant. Because if they initially meet strong resistance, then all the logistical problems, but very well described by our Swedish colleagues, would start hampering their operation. But if we let them to gain territory, to gain momentum, then we get on the losing track. And thereafter, all the discourse can start, also discourse fueled by the information warfare, that, okay, I mean, it's just about a few villages on the Latvian border. Should be, okay, just one more town, who cares? I mean, this is Pandora's box. If you let it start, you're lost. So my point here is that if territory, the slightest effort is done or is made in controlling the territory, the slightest part, smallest part of a NATO country territory, that's the moment for deterrence. Because otherwise, it's, in Hungarian there's a saying, I give my finger, but he wants my arm. I mean, that's the case. What's next? Part of the PR work. Up in Helsinki, we just published a longer analysis comparing the Transnistria conflict with Eastern Ukraine. And our argument is that the separatism in Eastern Ukraine has much less effect on Ukraine as Transnistria has on Moldova. Because what's the final point? Why do you create a frozen conflict? Not because you're a bad guy, but because you want to control or weaken the target country. And our point there is that Eastern Ukraine is comparatively much smaller and has much lesser effects on Ukraine than Transnistria does on Moldova. And at the same time, Eastern Ukraine is much more costly for Russia than Transnistria has ever been. I mean, 2 decades ago, during the Moldovan Civil War, Russia could basically get away with the whole story. I mean, the West was the West was paying attention to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, to the Yugoslav Civil War. Did Russia get any economic sanctions, financial sanctions? Nothing. Moldova, the Transnistrian conflict, they could create without any major hindrances. Now they are paying a price. And our logic, or our argument is that because the effect is much less than they expected, and the costs are much higher, we are afraid that in the shorter run, I mean, one option for them is to go and expand the controlled territory. So it's kind of an escalationist scenario, probably in the spring, when the weather would allow a larger scale military operation to continue. Or if Ukraine develops as it should, and it receives the political and military support from the West as it should, then a few years after Russia may probably get back and out from Eastern Ukraine, there are definite signs showing that they are not going for annexation, and they are very careful in handling the separatists in Eastern Ukraine. About what's next, everything, in my opinion, depends on the financial effects of the sanctions. Because that's the point where their backbone can be broken. And the backbone is already shaking. I mean, it's not immediate effect, but in 1 or 2 years, I very much agree with what was said before, the critical year will be 2016.
I think that it's important to show strength and force against Russia and to use all synergies we can get on all levels. That's very important. But there is one thing that scares me also. If we push them too hard, I have read in a white book from 2004 what they mean by de-escalation of conflict. So we need to be very clear about what we are doing. De-escalation conflict, that means use of nuclear weapons. And we will see maybe tomorrow what they will write in the new military doctrine. And we should also be aware that next year comes the civil defense doctrine in Russia and the white book. I think we will have a lot of answers there, how they look at their future and their capabilities, their opportunities, and maybe we can also see something about the intentions there. I would not like to guess anything here because I've been wrong about Ukraine. I didn't think they should do anything like that. But I'm convinced that we must think different. We must respect the knowledge they have, and if we should meet them, we should meet them with the same kind of knowledge. This is not a military problem. This is a much, much bigger problem. And we need to Bletchley Park people around, together with military experts, to handle this situation. Thank you.
So you asked about strategic communication, and you mentioned the Cold War. So I think, if I may, I think the question portrays the problem. Strategic communication is not a perfect term, but the focus of the term strategic communication has been on communication. Everybody's forgotten the word, the prefix is it. It should be about strategy. And almost the worst example of this is the fact that strategic communication lives in the public diplomacy division of NATO. So it's resigned to some kind of reactive PR type operation. It shouldn't be there, in my view. I wrote a paper published by CSSR with Colonel Rita LePage. It's in the wrong place. It needs to be in the military elements of military planning stuff. Because it's not all about communication. It might actually be that we don't communicate. That might be a perfectly valid response. It might be that we come up with something completely counterintuitive because it will resolve the issue. If we think on the first few nights of the huge crowds in Tahrir Square in Cairo, the presumption was everybody was there because they wanted to get rid of the regime. The fact was that in the research afterwards, we found that 35% of the people were there because they'd been paid $2 each to go by the Muslim Brotherhood. What happens if I'd known that information before and paid them $4 to go away? Yeah, the problem would have been halved that night. But we didn't know that. So the problem is, when we use the term strategic communication, we just think it's let's have a smart press release, let's do a really Gucci website, or let's tweet on a few issues. Yeah, it's just rubbish. It needs to be a really clever, sensible placement in the strategic thinking component of the pole mill piece as a whole, not just in the PDD of NATO. And the reason I don't think the Cold War is a good example, because that was a public diplomacy program that was designed to build in the minds of everybody this side of the wall, of the Iron Curtain. One, to erode confidence in the Soviet Union, and two, to build up the image of the West as a desirable place to be. I'm sure it was very successful in the act, but in the end of the day, it took 45 years for anything to happen. And probably it happened because people were so sick of the inadequacies of the Soviet centralized system, they knew the West was far more desirable place to be, but it was just their day-to-day existence. So I'm not sure the Cold War and the public diplomacy program, which was huge, admit that, is a particularly good example of this. It's like comparing apples and pears in my view.
Right, thank you. I think we heard an excellent panelist, and we now are in a time of thanking them for their insight, and then have a coffee break. So thank you for everyone.